Mwaniki, thank you for joining us on this interview. You were there to provide technical support for the UN during the 2008 xenophobic attacks in South Africa. What lessons were learned from 2008, if any?
I think if we take a look back, there are certain things that could have been done differently. Let's start with what the government response was. Initially, the government said they didn't want any of the displaced people, and at this point, we're numbering 100,000 people, to be placed in camps. I guess there was a fear of the government having people in camps in South Africa to depict South Africa as another failing African state. And therefore, so what happened was they set up what they called centers of safety. And these centers of safety indeed really were just camps, which allowed local organizations and community-based organizations to provide relief support. The lesson from that is that a speedier relief response could have actually been delivered to those who were displaced if they were put in organized camps right from the onset. In fact, the displacement patterns were very spontaneous and they just went to places they felt safer. So that's one lesson. For me, the other lesson is the post-xenophobic attacks response and the reintegration of the displaced back into community didn't take place as well as it should have. In fact, the reconciliation process which should have happened with the host communities where the displaced people had come from never really took off. And this is strange. As an analyst looking at South Africa that has got a history of reconciliation and understanding the importance of reconciliation, especially after your own reconciliation process, I thought that this would have been done probably differently and better. So in effect, what you have is displaced people who did not want to go back to those host communities and found other places of safety. And they huddled around each other and other migrants like them to find that safety. So the reintegration of displaced African migrants back into South African host communities never took place.
So right now, why is it black on black violence? People are asking themselves. There are white foreigners in South Africa. Why are they only attacking black African migrants?
I think that the attacks are happening around the fringes of the formal economy. And the fringes will be found in townships and informal settlements and in the what I would call the lower commercial sectors of the various cities in the country. And this probably is why there is very little interface between the blacks who are meeting out the violence, interacting with the white community. But having said that, you will recall that since previous to 2008, the xenophobic attacks and the typology of these attacks have focused more on African migrants. And granted, we must also recognize that some Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and one or two Chinese have been affected by these attacks, but it's largely being targeted towards African migrants. And so to me, there is a sense in South Africa that white migrants actually don't compete with black South Africans for jobs and access to services. So there is a perception that they are not really a threat to black South African labor.
What do you think is the cause of these attacks, and what is different with these attacks as to the 2008 ones, if there's any difference?
I think it's important for us to take a look at the whole picture. And when we reflect on the violence that's been meted out on African migrants in South Africa, we cannot look at two incidents, and that is 2008 and 2015. Indeed, since 2008, what the government says was the end of the previous xenophobic attacks, there have been over 350 black migrants who have been killed to date. And so I would argue that the attacks have not stopped. The sporadic targeting of black migrants in their businesses, in their places of residence, has continued since 2008. It has largely been documented and recorded as crime. But this is xenophobia. This is targeting black African migrants.
Now that brings me to my fourth question, which is government is calling it criminality, people are calling it xenophobia, some people are calling it Afrophobia. How can we describe?
It seems to be so important for people to label what these attacks really are. But what's interesting in the analysis is that the majority of those who are targeted are Africans. Xenophobia in itself is the process of othering people. So indeed there is some xenophobia. But when you look at the demographic that is targeted, these are Africans. And so those who say it is Afrophobia are actually not very far off the mark. Now the interesting thing is that both Afrophobia and xenophobia are crimes. And so to label this as criminality then kind of reduces the impact of a national psyche around othering people from Africa. I would say that indeed there are some criminal elements who do benefit when foreign nationals are attacked. And the good examples would be, to illustrate this point, would be the benefits that they get, for example, in the loot shops and so on and so forth. But one has to ask, what is the cause? And the single causal analysis really leads us to a single solution, which cannot work. I think it's a complex causal tapestry, and therefore the solutions must be very complex as well. We cannot say that it is poverty. We cannot say that it is a competition for jobs. We cannot say that it's competition for example, public goods and services. I think it's a combination of very many things. But one thing is clear, is that there is a sense of impunity. The average South African knows that nothing will happen to them if they attack a foreigner. To illustrate this point, I told you earlier that 350 African migrants have been killed since 2008. And during that whole time, only one person has been convicted for the murder of a foreign African national. So that tells you that there's a sense of impunity. And this is why you find bizarre situations like, the Mozambican national being stabbed in the street by people who feel they can do this and get away with it, because there's no precedence of people being prosecuted for attacking foreign nationals, especially when they're African.
Now, what effect do you think these attacks are going to have on South Africa's tourism, the economy, as well as relations they have with other African countries?
I think in the immediate term, we're going to see the blowback or the backlash from other African states who feel that their nationals have been affected by the xenophobic violence. And so, indeed, there will be an economic impact. We are already seeing, for example, the Deputy Minister for Trade saying that South Africa has lost billions in export forex earnings so far as a result of the xenophobic violence. So we are likely to see, to illustrate this, boycotts of South African products, boycotts of South African retail outlets, and that kind of thing. The tourism sector, in as much as South Africa's reputation in Africa has been very negatively affected, the tourism sector might not suffer as much as the other sectors. We know that the majority of tourists who come into South Africa actually come from the global north. And so therefore, the enclaves of tourism hotspots might not be as affected as other parts of the economy. But yes, there will be blowback in the immediate term on the economy. In terms of the geopolitical relations with other African countries, I worry that the tensions are going to escalate rather than dissipate even after the attacks have stopped. When we look at the rhetoric that's coming out of the capitals in Pretoria and Abuja, I see some saber rattling between nations that actually should be trying to simmer down the tensions. I find the posture and attitude of the South African government quite interesting. Because at one point, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation is reminding Nigeria that they also have Boko Haram, and that South Africa has not recalled the ambassador for the attacks that Boko Haram has meted on the Nigerians. And I find this a bit of a slap in the face. So I expect the tensions to escalate. I expect more African countries to take South Africa on for its lack of sensitivity on the reactions that have come across from the continent. And so in terms of international relations, we are going to see an icy period of South Africa interacting with its other members of the African Union.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on your show.